But for all of the allegations I've heard of them lying, of PragerU just not telling the truth, I have seen zero evidence to back that up. I haven't really seen anybody be able to point to a specific video and a specific statement to say, hey, this is not true, this is factually inaccurate, and here's why.
This is Lauren's lucky day.
Contrary to media headlines, the trend over the past couple of decades has been essentially flat.
No, it hasn't. All the temperature measurements show, and all the major climatological institutes in the world agree, that temperatures have been rising for 40 years, including the last 20. Simply repeating a shop-worn blogosphere myth won't make it magically come true. That's pretty much all of Patrick Moore's claims against carbon dioxide debunked.
Okay, so apparently the Gravel Institute has launched their own counter to PragerU. Lauren Chen, who has been in a few PragerU videos herself, has responded with a totally and completely objective video in response to this. So, let's have some fun fact-checking, Lauren. But before we get started, don't forget to click or tap the subscribe button and notification bell. Okay, so let's get to it.
But for all of the allegations I've heard of them lying, of PragerU just not telling the truth, I have seen zero evidence to back that up. I haven't really seen anybody be able to point to a specific video and a specific statement to say, hey, this is not true, this is factually inaccurate, and here's why.
This is Lauren's lucky day.
The last internet myth Moore presents at public speaking events is the old one about climate change stopped 15 or 18 or 19 or, in Moore's case, 20 years ago.
Contrary to media headlines, the trend over the past couple of decades has been essentially flat.
No, it hasn't. All the temperature measurements show, and all the major climatological institutes in the world agree, that temperatures have been rising for 40 years, including the last 20. Simply repeating a shop-worn blogosphere myth won't make it magically come true. That's pretty much all of Patrick Moore's claims against carbon dioxide debunked. If you thought, well, that was easy, yes, it was, because, as I always say, you don't need to be a genius to check facts. Just have a bit of skepticism and the ability to look things up.
And I love the irony, by the way, of the side with George Soros and all of academia in the palm of their hands, accusing others of being funded by billionaires to indoctrinate people.
Lauren is referring to this.
No, it's called PragerU. Imagine a huge stream of lies that pours into every computer in America. Imagine it's disguised to look unbiased and packaged into slick videos. And imagine oil billionaires give them tens of millions each year to indoctrinate your friends, your family. Well, that's PragerU.
In other words, she's responding to the Gravel Institute correctly pointing out that PragerU specifically is funded by oligarch families, and she is engaging in whataboutism and muddling the subject by comparing unquote sides, as opposed to who is specifically funding the Gravel Institute. So yes, PragerU has wealthy families and fossil fuel oligarchs funding them to make videos that lie about climate change and give a straw man version of the effects in income inequality, because these robber barons want to maintain their record low tax rates and don't want regulations getting in their way of baking the planet for their own profit. In other words, PragerU is simply a mouthpiece of old money interests. Lauren can't say the same for the Gravel Institute, so she creates this false equivalency by talking about sides and George Soros. Right-wing propaganda sources are obsessed with George Soros because that's the only billionaire they can cite who ever backed anything closely related to the left. Meanwhile, there are countless oligarchs funding projects on the right, including PragerU. Furthermore, the Gravel Institute has been critical of George Soros, so I'm guessing he's not bankrolling their new project.
And once again, really, it seems like this particular group's only real tangible issue with PragerU is that they are effective in promoting right-wing ideas.
No, they're concerned that these videos are full of lies, as can be seen in this clip, which Lauren conveniently omitted.
Imagine a huge stream of lies that pours into every computer in America. Imagine it's disguised to look unbiased and packaged into slick videos.
And now they're trying to fearmonger over harmless videos that have grown an organic audience because people are just interested in what their presenters have to say.
Nonsense. A $4 million annual marketing budget is hardly organic. And climate change and income inequality have severe consequences, so lying to millions of people about them just so a few oligarchs can keep more of their profits is not harmless. But of course, when you're part of the gravy train, I suppose this is what you're supposed to say.
In that it's a totally false comparison. PragerU presents mainstream conservative ideas as well as just classically liberal centrist ideas. In fact, some of their presenters are actually liberals.
I'm guessing she's referring to actors like Dave Rubin, who plays the role of the disaffected liberal whose alleged conversion makes no sense as he just happened to convert to the side where the money is. Check out my video on how I temporarily fell for the Dave Rubin grift.
In contrast to that, though, from everything I've seen, the people at the Gravel Institute are literal socialists. Don't believe me? Well, let's check the receipts. Heading over to their profile, we immediately see that about this week's presidential debate, they believe that, quote, Bernie would have won. In response to an accurate PragerU post stating that Marxism, wherever it's been tried, many people died, they retweeted a post by one of their presenters, who we'll get to in a second, saying, I have some bad news to break about capitalism. This group is explicitly anti-capitalism, and I know the Overton window keeps shifting left.
The Overton window has not been shifting left. In fact, quite the opposite. Taxes on the wealthy and corporations have been slashed over the last 40 years. Unions have been gutted. Both of these are back to pre-New Deal levels. As is income inequality.
But if you ask me, that is still an extremist and fringe position to have. They've also gone on to say that democracy without socialism is a joke, and the way to get young people to vote isn't doing dances on TikTok, it's free college, Medicare for all, and a Green New Deal. Yes, young people like free crap, this isn't news to anybody. So don't be fooled by the Gravel Institute trying to paint themselves as the anti-PragerU. They are not just liberals, they are not just Democrats, heck, they're not even just progressives, they are flat out socialists.
If they are socialist, that would in fact make them the mirror image of PragerU, whose espoused policies would actually bring us back to the Gilded Ages. But is the Gravel Institute actually socialist? I'm not sure they actually are. The word socialist can mean everything from a social democracy, which is what they have in other OECD countries that haven't gutted their middle class, to actual socialism. You could even argue we have social democracy here in the United States, just to a lesser extent. It simply refers to a capitalist economy in which extensive state regulation, with limited state ownership, has been employed by democratically elected governments, as in Sweden and Denmark, in the belief that it produces a fair distribution of income without impairing economic growth. This is often referred to as socialism, even though it isn't in the traditional sense of the word. This is in part because the right has referred to every economic policy that might actually help middle and lower income earners as socialist over the last few decades. I mean, seriously, if Hillary Clinton is a socialist, then the word has lost its meaning. Any economic policy to the left of Glenn Beck is apparently socialist. Here is David Pakman, explaining the basic framework of social democracy.
What I do think as a social democrat, though, is the bottom should be lifted. There should be a safety net that says we're not going to allow people to fall below this level. And then at the top, you should have more restrictions about, okay, if we say billionaires are okay, are multi-billionaires, turbo billionaires, at what point do we want to be saying now is when you've got to really be redistributing? It's a gray area. Different people would put it at a different spot. We have all of the different tools, but the problem is getting the right combination.
Ground, it should come as no surprise that the topic Gray chose to do her Gravel Institute video on is why big government is good.
No, that is not the topic of the video. The topic of the video was to refute the right-wing arguments that the size of government is the problem. The video doesn't argue that big government is automatically good. But we'll unpack this straw man argument later in the video. But first, Lauren is clearly ignoring this portion of the video.
And there's no truth to the claim that the bigger the government, the less free the people. In fact, the countries at the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank, ranks as freer than the United States, countries like Sweden or Denmark have much larger governments relative to their populations than the United States. A large government doesn't mean an unfree population. You see, government isn't a problem in and of itself. In a country as sprawling and diverse as America, there needs to be an institution to build infrastructure and inspect food and to put out fires, to do things that help our communities even if they don't turn a profit. Think of the US Postal Service, which provides hundreds of thousands of good jobs while allowing people to cheaply mail packages across the country. Or think of Medicare and Medicaid, which are credited with having saved millions of lives. So the problem isn't the size of government, it's who controls the government. As a percentage of the economy, federal spending is smaller now than it was in 1954.
So this video starts off trying to convince you that big government is good, actually, by asserting that government now isn't even all that big to begin with. And even though they're not technically lying in this segment, it is one of the best examples of misinformation I have ever seen, eventually peaking again and dwarfing any previous spending at the height of World War II. After the war was over, spending fell down again, but it had a slight resurgence in the 50s, i.e. the year that the Gravel Institute conveniently chooses to compare present-day spending to. So yes, technically it is true that there are points in history in the past where US government spending was more than it is today, but that doesn't change the fact that the overall trend throughout the past century of government spending is that it gradually increases.
Actually, on a federal level, those increases are almost entirely due to cost increases in Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. This is not surprising as our elderly grow as a percentage of the population, the cost of healthcare increases, and poverty rates continue to increase. In fact, infrastructure spending is decreasing on a federal level. Infrastructure spending is increasing at local levels, likely due to the decrease in federal support.
That data measures government spending as a percentage of GDP, meaning that if the economy is growing, then government spending can also grow without the government spending figure actually changing, even though spending is increasing. I personally think that is a terrible way to measure or validate the size of government. I mean, just because your economy is bigger, why does that have to mean that your government is spending more?
Because there is a larger infrastructure to support. More cars on the road, more roads to build and maintain. Larger population and more residents. More policemen and firefighters out there. More buildings. More inspectors. That's how it works when it comes to functioning first world countries. Also, as previously noted, most of this increase has to do with increased costs in Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, not in some increase in new programs. But it's better that you hear this from a well-renowned economist.
I was in China in the fall of 2006. Living for a month in a southern city because my in-laws are there, and my wife took our two daughters there and put them in the schools. And I was working on the manuscript of this book. And I got to the section where I had to address the problem of regulation. And I realized that there were things you could see with your own eyes that were very illuminating. China is, and particularly the southern coastal regions of China, a very prosperous place. Real wages are visibly rising. People are well fed. They are stylishly clothed. They are comfortably housed. Right? You can live there in perfect security and ease. My daughter could walk to school and back a kilometer each way twice a day. Nobody bothered her. But you knew, nevertheless, that you were not quite in a first world country. And when you thought about it, here are some of the reasons. You knew that if you got hit by a car, EMS was not going to be there in 90 seconds. Right? Seriously, it's an important point. You knew that if you went to the grocery store, you did not bring the salad home and wash it in the tap and put it on your table. Right? You brought vegetables home, you washed them in boiled water, and you cooked them before you ate them. Why did you do that? Why does my mother-in-law to this day unplug her electrical appliances at night before she goes to bed? The answer is, in all of these cases, you did not have a regulatory system that you trusted. You didn't trust the city water to be free of bacteria because you knew by and large it was unlikely that it was. You didn't trust the food system to be free of E. coli and other contaminants because you had pretty good reason to believe that it wasn't. And there was no credible authority protecting those lines of economic activity. Similarly, with electrical appliances, you weren't entirely confident that what you had that they were fully and properly tested. It tells you that regulation is actually essential to a modern, technically sophisticated economic society. credible regulation is not something that you impose on the market. It is something that makes markets of all kinds that matter to us possible. You know very well that you would not get on an aircraft, no matter how much you admire the technical capacity of the Boeing Corporation and the quality of its planes, which are excellent, if you did not believe that the Federal Aviation Administration had an appropriate and effective means of air traffic control. There's two Boeings running into each other, and the effects on both of them are pretty bad usually. Right? It's the regulation that makes the system work, and nowhere is this more true than in finance.
And the US spends less on government than other countries, like Germany or Finland, that have lower rates of poverty and higher rates of economic mobility. The American dream is more alive in these big government countries than in America.
There are a lot of differences between the US, Germany, and Finland.
True, but this comparison also holds for every other advanced OECD nation, not just Germany and Finland. In fact, I'm surprised the Gravel Institute video simply cherry-picked those two countries. The United States has the worst income inequality of all advanced OECD nations, and does indeed have among the smallest governments as a percentage of GDP.
But if you ask a socialist why it is that Germany and Finland perform better than the US in certain metrics, they'll say it's because the government is bigger and the taxes are higher. That is the answer to prosperity. Is that right, though?
No, it is not right. But that's a straw man argument. The Gravel Institute video is refuting the argument that big government is the problem, by pointing out that countries with larger governments actually have lower poverty rates and more equitable economies. And while we're at it, they also tend to have higher literacy rates and educational outcomes and lower infant mortality rates. Therefore, these bumper sticker platitudes about big government being the problem are wrong. Obviously, big government for the mere sake of having a big government isn't the solution. The idea here is that these democracies use their government spending to create vibrant economies that work better for all quintiles, not just those at the top.
It couldn't possibly be because they have overwhelmingly homogeneous populations, right? Populations that, by the way, also have a higher average IQ and narrower distribution than the US does.
As I pointed out earlier, it's not just Germany and Finland who are outperforming the United States in terms of equity and other measures of personal prosperity. Most other advanced OECD nations are as well, and this includes several nations that have higher ethnic fractionalization than the United States. Furthermore, we can look at our own history here in the United States, and see how the creation of the 20th century middle class is commensurate with the implementation of New Deal policies, as we increase unionization rates as well as taxes on the wealthy and corporations. We can also see how the middle class begins to unravel as we roll these initiatives back, as we enter the age of trickle-down economics. After decades of gutting unions and cutting taxes for the wealthy and corporations, all of the economic gains have gone to the top, as the majority of workers have seen their paychecks fall behind the costs of living.
If it was true that you could just big government and tax any population into happiness and success, then the story of the Soviet Union would be very different.
Nice, Lauren. That's very clever and will look great on a bumper sticker. But no one is making that argument.
And I've just never understood how people like Gray can acknowledge how corrupt government is, yet at the same time lobby to make it bigger and to give them more power. I think they're under the naive assumption that government and government workers can just be this benevolent force in it for the good of humanity, but
the answer is quite simple if you pay attention to what people like this are lobbying for. For one, they want money out of politics. This way politicians can't be so easily swayed. In Lauren's naive view of the world, if the government is small, then large money interests don't have much of a government to influence and all is well, hooray. What people like her don't realize is that money interests only lobby politicians so they can assert their own influence. A small government just means a government that can't get in the way of the sort of old rich money interests who fund PragerU, of which Lauren is part of. Then, said old money interests can simply assert their influence without government interference and/or they can assert full control over said government. This is why it's in fact small governments that tend to be the most corrupt, and large governments that tend to be the least corrupt. Furthermore, if we look at the Heritage Foundation's own Economic Freedom Index, the top of the rankings are filled with countries with larger governments while the lower echelons are filled with small government countries. This isn't about freedom. These old money interests want more influence, and many ideologues want to take us back to the Gilded Ages.
In the 1950s, when the economy was growing faster than ever, the richest people in the country paid an income tax of 91%. The corporate income tax was above 50%. But after decades of tax cuts for the rich, the 400 richest Americans pay a lower tax rate than the bottom 10%.
Now, this part of the video is just blatantly untrue. Despite what progressives might keep saying, it's just not the reality that the poor and working class out there are paying more in taxes than the wealthy. And since I'm no tax expert, allow me to share this piece from the Heritage Foundation.
Yes. The Gravel Institute video probably did botch this claim. The appropriate claim is that the wealthiest 400 families pay a lower effective tax rate than the bottom 50%, not the bottom 10%. What's important to note here is how many of the wealthiest Americans make their money. For example, capital gains are taxed at a far lower rate than income. This is why Warren Buffett pays a lower tax rate than his secretary, who makes around $60,000 per year.
Bosonic is making waves because she makes less money than her billionaire boss, but pays a higher tax rate than he does.
Yeah, Deb is typical. She's right in the middle.
In 2010, Bosonic paid a nearly 36% tax rate. Buffett, who made $62 million that year, paid less than half of that. Now Bosonic and her boss are campaigning for something the president calls the Buffett Rule, requiring millionaires to pay at least 30% in income tax.
House Speaker Boehner was asked about the Buffett Rule, and he said, well, we all know that there's a
reason we have low rates on capital gains. That's because it spurs new investment in our economy.
He's wrong. I mean, people like to make money in investing, and they make it if the tax rate's 15% in share, and if they make it if the tax rate's 30% in share.
Buffett made about triple what GOP candidate Mitt Romney made in 2010, yet Romney has been taken to task by some for his tax rate.
I don't blame Governor Romney for paying the tax rate he paid. I blame the U.S. Congress.
Do you think this will be a defining issue in this year's election?
I think it should be a defining issue. Debbie works just as hard as I do, and she pays at twice the rate I pay. I think that's outrageous.
Also important to note is that the study in question takes into account things like state and sales taxes, as well as things like licenses for motor vehicles, toll roads, sin taxes, etc. Remember, the lower your income, the higher percentage of your income these will consume. So, even though federal income taxes may be non-existent for the lowest income Americans, their incomes are so low that these other taxes and fees do account for a sizable percentage of their income. That said, it is unlikely that the lowest 10% pay a lower tax rate than the wealthiest 400 families. But the claim is almost certainly true if you compare the 400 wealthiest families to the middle quintiles. And either way, it is still true that taxes on the wealthy have been slashed over the last 40 years. This applies to both capital gains taxes, as well as the top marginal income tax rates. But before we move forward, keep in mind that the claim is being made in regards to the 400 wealthiest families, who are generating their wealth through sources of revenue that are taxed a lower rate than incomes. This is important, because the Heritage Foundation, who Lauren is about to cite, always plays hide the ball with this. They are about to change the subject to the top income earners, which ignores the source of revenue of the super wealthy. Yes, the income tax is indeed progressive, even though it is less progressive than it once was. Every time a study is published noting that the super wealthy pay a lower tax rate because capital gains are taxed at a lower rate, there's a Heritage Foundation article to muddle the story by solely focusing on income taxes.
It says that, quote, using data from a new book by Berkeley economists Emmanuel Zayes and Gabriel Zucman, i.e. the people the Gravel Institute cite, the Times claims that the tax rate on the highest income Americans was 23% in 2018, falling below the tax rates of all other income groups.
No, not the highest income earners. The wealthiest 400 families. Like I said, the Heritage Foundation always does this, because they are not a real think tank, they are an ideological article mill. Every finding is the same. Government bad. Taxes bad. Regulations bad. Free market good. Low taxes good.
To get this result, they had to cook the books, systematically inflating the income of the richest Americans without also increasing taxes, and leaving out important transfer programs for poor Americans, such as the Earned Income Tax Credit, which can more than offset the cost of the payroll tax for some with low incomes.
Zucman, one of the economists who published this study, has addressed this. Here is a snippet from the National Post. Zucman countered that his and Saez's analysis considers the AIC and other credits like it as transfers of income, akin to food stamps or jobless benefits, rather than tax provisions. If you start counting some transfers as negative taxes, it is not clear where to stop, he said via email. Do you treat the AIC as a negative tax? Veterans benefits? Medicaid? Defense spending? There's no clear line, and the results become arbitrary. There is general agreement among economists, however, that the tax burden of the rich has fallen considerably in recent decades. The rich definitely pay less in taxes than they did in the past and less than they should, Furman said. The bulk of Saez and Zuckman's new book explores how that happened, and how the trend might be reversed.
The most recent IRS data from 2016 shows that the top 10% of income earners pay almost 70% of federal income taxes.
Again, with the focus on federal income taxes, and now she's referring to the top 10% of those earners. In other words, people working really high-paying jobs, not the ultra-wealthy, which is what Saez's study was focused on. Furthermore, this focus on federal income taxes ignores other, more regressive taxes like state payroll, sales taxes, and other fees like toll roads. Lastly, yes, the top decile has done okay as the wages of the bottom 4 quintiles have stagnated and even fallen behind rising costs of living, as more of the wealth is concentrated at the top. So yes, it's not surprising the top 10% of income earners are going to pay a larger share of federal income taxes, given that they are taking home a much larger share of the income. It's called math.
Additionally, looking at all federal taxes, the Congressional Budget Office shows that the top 1% pay an average federal tax rate of 33.3%. The data also shows tax rates decline with income, and the poorest 20% of the population pays an average tax rate of just 1.7%.
Once again, this is only focusing on federal taxes and ignoring the more regressive tax rates. It's also measuring the top 1% instead of the wealthiest 400 families, which is much smaller and has a much higher concentration of wealth and is more likely to obtain their wealth from sources with lower tax rates. Lastly, this data is from 2016, meaning it's prior to Trump's 2017 windfall for the wealthy, which is what Saez's study measures.
While American workers have become dramatically more productive, their wages have stagnated or fallen. The average hourly wage was higher in 1974 than it was in 2018. This has led to a stark gap in qualities of life.
I always find it funny when socialists try to blame stagnant wages on capitalism.
I don't think they're necessarily blaming capitalism, but rather the trickle-down economics scam that's been perpetuated on the American economy over the last few decades. The America with higher rates of unionization and higher taxes on corporations and the wealthy was just as capitalist as the economy we have now. Isn't this when America was great anyhow?
Capitalism isn't to blame for stagnant wages. It's immigration. For example, if I'm a makeup artist.
Okay, Lauren goes on to give a hypothetical scenario, where she's a makeup artist, setting her own rates, only to find herself undercut by an influx of immigrants offering the same service for lower prices. Yes, this is her explanation for the stagnant wages experienced across the 4 bottom quintiles. In other words, no, it's not immigration. It can certainly be argued that, to an extent, they depress wages for low-skilled, entry-level labor. I say to a certain extent, but it's been shown that at least some of the jobs immigrants take are jobs that American citizens won't do. But the disparity in income has taken place much further at the top. Furthermore, the U.S. experienced a steady influx of immigrants while maintaining a healthy middle class. The Great Divergence begins well before the immigration spike from Asia and Latin America, and in fact, coincides with the trickle-down policies of union busting and tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations. But of course, the robber barons who fund PragerU don't want you to know this.